The train rattled as Michael curled up on the metal bench of the New York subway, hid his face in his hands. Tears dripped onto the crumpled piece of paper he held, a stained note written to a mother he had never met. Rachel Moore, rushing to the most important meeting of the month, stopped in front of him, not because of the crying, but because she caught a glimpse of the surname printed on the envelope. And in that instant, something inside her told her this meeting was no coincidence. If this story has already touched you, imagine what comes next. Leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the ending. Michael was hunched on the metal bench, his back curved, knees drawn up, chin sunk into his chest. His dark skin contrasted with the cold, flickering light of the carriage. His hands, marked by scratches and dust, hid part of his face. Despite his attempt to become invisible, the muffled sound of a sob escaped from time to time. Between his fingers, a crumpled piece of paper, not just any paper, but an aged note, yellowed at the edges and with dark stains that could have been coffee or old tears. The handwritten words were blurred, but still legible enough to reveal that it was addressed to a mother he had never met. The envelope was torn at one corner, and the top looked as though it had been handled so many times it no longer held its shape. Rachel Moore entered the carriage in a rush, balancing on her heels while adjusting the leather briefcase under her arm and trying, with the other hand, to finish an email on her phone. She had only a few minutes before the most important meeting of the month, and the screen flashed with urgent notifications. She had no time nor the patience to get distracted, but as her eyes quickly swept across the carriage, something to her left interrupted her automatic flow of steps. The boy. First, it was his posture that caught her attention, an almost instinctive hunch like someone bracing for a blow that never came. Then, the detail of the tears falling directly onto the note. And finally, what truly made her stop, the envelope. A name printed there, worn but still recognizable. Moore. Rachel stood still for a moment, the subway gently rocking. It wasn't unusual to see suffering in New York. The city, in all its hurry, was full of invisible stories. But there was something different here, a feeling that didn't come from pity or curiosity, but from a silent recognition she couldn't explain. The train jolted sharply. Michael instinctively clutched the note to his chest, as if protecting a treasure or a piece of his very life. Rachel felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the stuffy heat of the carriage. She approached slowly. "Are you okay?" she asked. Noticing her voice came out softer than she intended, Michael lifted his eyes for a second. Brown, deep, carrying a moist glimmer that mixed fear with a spark of hope. He didn't answer. He just sniffled and shook his head, looking away. Rachel didn't push. She sat down on the opposite bench and discreetly kept watching. She noticed the state of his pant hems, dirty and frayed, the old backpack with a broken zipper, the worn-out sneakers showing the insole. Every detail painted a silent picture of neglect. The sharp whistle announced the next station. The doors opened and a cold wind blew in, bringing the smell of wet asphalt. Rachel could have stood up and gone on her way. The meeting, the numbers, the campaign approval, all of it awaited her. But her feet stayed firmly planted. She looked again at the envelope. The surname printed there wasn't rare in the city. New York had many Moores. And yet, something inside her knew this wasn't a coincidence. Michael carefully placed the note inside his backpack. With almost ceremonial care, Rachel felt a lump in her throat. It had been years since she'd experienced that strange sensation of being on the verge of crossing an invisible line. The train began moving again, screeching on the rails. Rachel took a deep breath. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, as if weighing each word was vital. "Michael." His voice was low, almost swallowed by the metallic noise, but clear enough for Rachel to hear. Something in that sound stirred a distant memory, a forgotten spark. The doors opened again. This time, Rachel knew she wasn't going to leave. The subway arrived at the next station, and the announcement echoed through the carriage. The doors opened with the usual hiss, letting in a blast of icy air. Michael didn't move. He stayed seated, his left hand gripping the strap of his backpack as if the world outside was more hostile than the worn-out train car. Rachel looked at the platform and then back at him. The phone screen vibrated in her hand, the reminder for the most important meeting of the month. She could get off at that moment, climb the stairs, run 2 blocks, and still make it on time. But something inside her told her that if she stood up, she would never see that boy again, and the thought bothered her more than she cared to admit. "Are you getting off?" she asked without thinking. He lifted his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He stood up slowly, adjusting his backpack. They stepped onto the platform together and walked side by side in silence. In the narrow corridor, Rachel felt the weight of the choice she was about to make. She could say goodbye and head to her meeting, but the image of him curled up on the subway bench seemed to hold her in place. When they reached the concourse, she stopped. "Have you had breakfast today?" she asked. Michael frowned, suspicious. "No. There's a coffee shop nearby, my treat." He hesitated, glancing around as if calculating risks. "I don't have money." "I know. It's not about that." She smiled, trying to ease the tension. The clock on her phone showed she was already late. The meeting wouldn't happen without her, but for the first time in a long while it didn't seem to matter. They went to a small cafe with a narrow facade and windows fogged by the warmth inside. The aroma of freshly ground beans surrounded them as soon as they walked in. Rachel ordered 2 coffees and a croissant. At first, Michael stood near the door until she called him over to sit. In the first few minutes, words between them were scarce. Rachel asked about his age, school, but the answers were short. At one point, Michael took the note from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and stared at it as if each letter were a memory. "Who's it for?" she asked, pointing. "For someone who doesn't know me." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "But do you know this person?" "Only by name." He ran his finger over the smudged letters. "They told me she left me when I was born." Rachel felt a lump in her throat, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, without anger, like someone who had learned to live with it. While he ate the croissant, Rachel watched him, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes darting quickly around, as if always on alert for someone who might throw him out. It was an instinct you don't learn, only inherit from years of uncertainty. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" she asked. 145th Street Station. Rachel didn't look away. "What if you came with me?" He stared at her, confused. "Where to?" "My apartment. Just for a few days until we find a solution." Michael gripped the cup tightly. "Why?" "Because no one should sleep in a station." Silence settled until he gave a slight nod. Rachel took a deep breath. The meeting, already lost, could be explained later. She couldn't remember the last time she had made such an impulsive decision, but at that moment, she couldn't imagine making any other choice. When they stepped outside, snow was starting to fall in small flakes. Michael walked beside her with cautious steps, as if unsure this was real. Rachel, for her part, felt a mix of concern and determination. As they moved through the streets, she thought about how she would explain her absence at the office, but the truth was that something far more important had begun inside her. The cold wind cut through the streets of Manhattan as Rachel and Michael walked toward her building. Tiny snowflakes landed on the boy's shoulders, though he didn't seem to feel the cold. He kept his worn backpack strapped to his body, as if any lapse in attention could cost him everything he had. Rachel felt the silent weight of her choice. She had skipped the most important meeting of the month, knowing her explanations at the office would be weak. Still, with every step, she grew more certain there was something more urgent than any contract or presentation. The building's lobby was warm, lit by discreet chandeliers and decorated with tall green plants. The doorman, used to seeing her come in alone, raised his eyebrows at the sight of Michael. Rachel met his gaze with a brief nod, offering no explanation. They entered the elevator. The silence was heavy, broken only by the slow hum of the motor as it climbed. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the floor, as if afraid to meet her gaze, or his own reflection in the mirrored walls. Inside the apartment, the scent of vanilla mingled with the warmth from the central heating. Michael stopped at the doorway, unmoving, looking around as if every detail belonged to another world. The soft rug, the framed pictures on the wall, the wide windows with a view of the glowing city. Rachel took off her coat and pointed toward the hallway. "The guest room is the second door on the right. You can leave your things there." He stepped in slowly, dropped his backpack in the corner, and ran his hand over the clean sheet as if unsure he was allowed to touch it. Rachel went to the kitchen, warmed some milk, and mixed in chocolate. When she came back, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out at the city through the window. "Here," she said, handing him the mug. "It'll warm you up." Michael held it with both hands, brought his face close to the steam, and took a deep breath before sipping. Rachel sat in the nearby armchair and after a few moments asked, "Michael, have you ever worked before?" He frowned. "Not really. Once I carried boxes in a warehouse." Another time I cleaned tables in a restaurant. But nothing steady. Rachel gave a faint smile. I know someone who needs help. A friend of mine, Karen, has a cafe nearby. It's quiet, and she's looking for someone to serve tables, clean, restock things. Would you be willing? Michael looked down at the mug, turning it between his fingers. I don't know if I can do it right. I think you can, Rachel said firmly. And I think you deserve to try. He looked up. And could I stay here? In the meantime? At least until we find a safer path for you. The silence that followed was charged. Michael gave the smallest of nods, but Rachel understood it meant more than just yes. The next morning, Rachel woke before her alarm. When she entered the kitchen, she found Michael sitting at the table, staring at a loaf of bread on the counter as if waiting for permission to eat it. Go ahead, she said with a smile. We've got an important day ahead. He ate in silence, and soon they headed to the cafe. The cold was biting, but the aroma of fresh coffee surrounded them as soon as they walked in. The place had exposed brick walls, worn wooden tables, and a counter polished by years of use. Karen, a warm, smiling, middle-aged woman, was wiping the counter when they arrived. Karen, this is Michael, Rachel said. He's looking for an opportunity. Karen extended her hand. You'll learn fast here. All you need is the will. Michael shook her hand and got to work. Rachel lingered, pretending to scroll through her phone, but she was really watching. She saw him learn to clean tables, restock napkins, balance trays. Karen showed him how to use the coffee machine, and before long he was serving a cappuccino without spilling. By the end of the shift, Michael was tired, but there was a brightness in his eyes. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit his face, but his stride was different, more confident. Karen said I can come back tomorrow, he said almost proudly. I knew you'd do well, Rachel replied. They returned to the apartment. The smell of pasta and tomato sauce filled the kitchen as she cooked and he washed the salad. They sat down to dinner, and Michael asked questions about the neighborhood, about what it was like to work in an office, and about the city lights he could see from the bedroom window. After dinner, Rachel went to the living room and saw him standing in the hallway, holding the crumpled note. He noticed her watching, slipped the paper back into his pocket, and walked to his room without a word. Rachel was left alone, with the sense that that small piece of paper held answers she wasn't ready to hear. The following days settled into a rhythm that, for Rachel, would have seemed unlikely just a few days before. Michael left early for Karen's cafe, returned in the late afternoon, and almost always brought small stories from the day. They were never long, but there was a careful choice in his words, as if he weighed what was worth sharing. At the apartment, Rachel noticed gestures that spoke louder than full sentences. Michael lined up his shoes neatly at the entrance, folded the blanket on the couch in the morning, wiped down the kitchen counter without being asked. There was a quiet desire there, to show he deserved to stay. One cold night after dinner, Rachel found him in the kitchen washing dishes with almost exaggerated care. The foam covered his small, bony hands, and he seemed distant, his gaze fixed on the running water. Everything okay? She asked, leaning against the doorway. He shrugged. Just thinking. About what? Michael took a deep breath. I lived with 3 different families. None of them wanted to keep me for long. Rachel swallowed the automatic reply she wanted to give. That doesn't mean... It means I wasn't what they wanted. He cut her off, not angrily, but with the certainty of someone who had heard it before, in far crueler ways. Rachel sighed. Maybe they didn't know what they were losing. He didn't answer. He finished washing the last plate, dried his hands, and went to his room. In the days that followed, Rachel began to notice something. Michael always had the crumpled note close by, at the cafe in his pants pocket on the bedroom table while he folded clean laundry, a piece of paper that seemed more like a piece of himself. One afternoon, he came back from work with a box of bread Karen had given him. He set it on the counter and, without realizing it, dropped the note. Rachel picked it up before he could. You keep this with you all the time, don't you? She said, handing it back. He nodded. It's all I have of her. Your mother? Yes. And what's her name? Rachel asked, trying to sound casual. Michael unfolded the note and read it like a sacred recitation. Rachel A. Moore. Her heart raced. For a few seconds she stayed silent, staring at the paper in his hands. Same as mine, she said with a restrained smile. Coincidence. Michael shrugged. Maybe. That conversation stayed in Rachel's mind. At night, Lying in bed, she felt old memories surface against her will. The sterile smell of a hospital, the weight of a baby in her arms, her mother's firm hand pushing documents toward her to sign. At 16, she had been told it was the best thing to do. Michael, without realizing it, seemed increasingly at ease in the apartment. He began making breakfast, improvising recipes, and even laughing quietly at a TV show. These simple moments, things she had always considered ordinary, had become unexpectedly precious. One Friday night, they sat down for dinner. Rachel talked about a difficult client at work, and Michael told her about a man who tried to pay for his coffee entirely in foreign coins. They laughed together. His laugh was short but genuine, and Rachel realized she wanted to hear more of it. Later, in the stillness of the night, Rachel woke and went to get a glass of water. She found Michael sitting at the kitchen table, the note open in front of him. He was staring at the smudged letters. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Sometimes I think that if I find her, I won't know what to say." Rachel watched him for a few seconds. Maybe just saying hi would be enough. And what if she doesn't want me? The question carried an old, heavy fear. "Then the problem isn't you," Rachel replied firmly. He folded the note slowly, as if it were fragile, slipped it into his pocket and stood up. Before leaving, he looked at her but said nothing. Rachel stayed there, staring at the empty space on the table, feeling that the paper carried answers that could change everything. That night, she dreamed of the past. The small bedroom from her teenage years, the suitcase ready on the floor, her mother's insistent voice, the muffled crying. She woke with the feeling that she was getting closer to a truth she might not be ready to face. Saturday dawned gray, with low clouds covering the city. Rachel woke early but stayed in bed, listening to the distant sound of traffic. The smell of coffee coming from the kitchen told her Michael was already up. In recent days, she had felt a weight in her chest every time she saw the note in his hands. The name written there wasn't just a coincidence. Deep down, she knew that. When she left her room, she found Michael at the table sorting coins into neat stacks. He looked up briefly, said a quick, "Good morning," and went back to his task. Rachel made toast, but the silent tension between them seemed heavier than the cold morning air. After breakfast, Michael said he was heading to Karen's cafe, even though it was his day off, to help with the cleaning. Rachel nodded and stayed alone in the apartment. She took the opportunity to open a box stored in the guest room closet, a place she rarely touched. Among old papers and yellowed photographs, she found a folder with hospital documents. The baby's name wasn't listed, only an admission code and a date. Exactly 12 years ago. She sat on the floor, knees bent, her heartbeat quickening. Memories came back with startling clarity. The cold hallway, her mother's hand gripping hers. The trembling signature. The baby being carried away by a nurse who never looked back. Rachel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In the early afternoon, Michael returned. He carried a bag of bread and, as always, the note folded in his pocket. He sat on the sofa, and Rachel, still holding the folder, stood before him. "Michael, I need to ask you something," she said softly. He looked up. "What? This note? Who gave it to you?" "I found it in an envelope among my things at the shelter. They said it was from when I was a baby, that my mother wrote it but never managed to give it to me." Rachel's stomach turned. "Can I see it?" He hesitated for a moment, then handed her the paper. Rachel held it carefully, as if it were glass. She read each line. She recognized the handwriting, the same she had in her teenage notebooks. At the end, a sentence she had never forgotten. "Even if you never meet me, know that I will always love you." Tears began to fall before she could stop them. Michael watched her, puzzled. "Why are you crying?" Rachel took a deep breath, but her voice faltered. "Because I wrote this." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael blinked a few times, trying to process. "What?" "I was 16. I couldn't take care of you. I was pressured to let you go." She pressed the paper to her chest. "I didn't know where you were, if you were alive, if you were happy, until that day on the subway." Michael leaned back slightly as if he needed space to process. He looked at the floor, then at her. You're my mom?" Rachel nodded, eyes brimming. "Yes." He stood still for a few seconds, breathing quickly. Then he walked to the window and stared out at the city. Rachel stayed where she was, afraid to move closer. "Why now?" His voice was low. "Because now I know where you are, and I'm not letting you go again." Michael closed his eyes, fighting back tears. Slowly, he turned around. Rachel took a step forward but stopped, waiting for him to decide. He looked at her for a long moment, then, almost hesitantly, took 2 steps and fell into her arms. Rachel held him tightly, feeling the weight and warmth of his body. It was a long embrace, filled with years of absence, unanswered questions, and a love that had never stopped existing. They stayed like that for an immeasurable time. When they finally pulled away, Michael gave her a shy half-smile. "So, I guess now it makes sense why you wanted me to work with your friend." Rachel laughed through her tears. "And it makes sense for you to keep staying here." That night, they had dinner together, as if they'd always done it. They didn't talk much about the past. They knew those conversations would come in time. But for the first time, Rachel felt the house was complete. Across the room, on the table, the note rested open, not as a reliquary of pain, but as a symbol of reunion. If you were in Michael's place, what would you say upon discovering who was standing in front of you? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this moving story, like and subscribe to see more moments like this that touch and transform lives. Now stay tuned for another video playing on your screen. See you there.